if you stay below 25 on the glycemic index, you bypass that whole system. And instead of counting calories, you could just look at the glycemic index. It's almost impossible to store fat when you're keeping your ingredients below 25 on the glycemic index. That's the magic number.
Okay, so what's the glycemic index? If you have ever tried to lose weight, there is a very good chance that you have come across the glycemic index. It's this massive and confusing list that ranks food from 0 to 100. And the ranking is based on how fast these foods raise your blood sugar levels. And for many years, like that man has implied, the rule has been very simple. High GI foods, GI standing for glycemic index, high GI foods are bad and low GI foods are good for you. And this has turned the way people eat into some kind of math project because they want to avoid eating the high GI foods, which are said to make weight loss impossible because they somehow lock in your fat cells and they make weight loss something that cannot be done. And so people stop eating things like carrots and pasta because they're told that these foods are too high on the scale. And they start swapping out foods that they like for foods that they don't like because they're told that brown rice is better than their jasmine rice. So they say goodbye to their jasmine rice and they start eating brown rice that they don't even like. I like brown rice, but there are people out there who don't like brown rice and quinoa, and they're eating these foods because they're said to be better for them when it comes to weight loss. And that's because many people live in fear of the spike, because when you eat a high GI food, what do? You spike your blood sugar levels. But does the speed of a carbohydrate actually dictate how much fat you will gain or lose? Does it really dictate the size of your waistline? Or are we ignoring that we don't eat food in a vacuum, that the GI index is not all that matters when it comes to how we eat? Today we are going to slow down the clock on this glycemic index and understand exactly what role it plays in weight loss. Hello everyone and welcome back. I'm Daisy, aka D, and I'm here to simplify the science to make it easier for you to stick to your weight loss goals. And today's meat is what I would call a heavy hitter, which is the idea that you have to eat low GI foods if you want to lose weight, and you have to avoid high GI foods. I see this all the time, and if you've looked at high GI foods and low GI foods online, you may have noticed that people tend to be terrified of eating bread, rice, pasta, and all these other foods that are considered to be high GI. And for women, this fear is especially so because we have so much misinformation when it comes to how we lose or gain weight. People start thinking that high GI foods are this reset button that will put them back where they started. But the reality is that the glycemic index is a tool for clinical settings, and it is not a golden rule when it comes to weight loss. In fact, if you look at weight loss from purely a weight loss perspective, you will realize that it doesn't really matter what you're eating. It doesn't matter whether you're eating high GI foods or low GI foods, because at the end of the day, what really matters is the total amount of energy that you consume, not how fast that energy hits your bloodstream. Now that said, let's talk about why the GI index is considered lab eating compared to actual eating, the magic that comes when you buffer your carbs with protein, and why, surprisingly, high GI foods can be good for you. Well, it all depends on the context, but they can really be good for you. Let's get started. Have you heard of the low GI food diet? It's this trend that has been going on online where people start eating foods that are low on the GI index in order to lose weight. And I came across a creator who has been doing the same thing, and I'll let her explain her journey to you.
One of the number one things that helped me with my 30-pound weight loss with hypothyroidism, with PCOS, is this medicine that I take 3 times a day. It's super cheap. You don't need a prescription. You can get it anywhere. It's super affordable, and it's actually right here. So my first pillar is that I follow a low glycemic index diet. This is where I apply the research, the science into my diet. If you have weight loss resistance, if you have PCOS, you more than likely have a problem with balancing your blood sugar. It's actually a very sustainable diet and it's very easy to implement. And I'm going to tag some videos in the caption where I speak more in detail about this diet.
Her diet looks really nice. It's full of very minimally processed foods, and I can see why that will lead to weight loss. Not because these foods are low in GI, but because they are minimally processed. And as you might know, eating minimally processed foods, foods in their whole form, is very good for weight loss journeys because you end up eating a lot of fiber, you feel fuller for longer. These nutrients are not just good for helping you hit your macros, but they also help you in normal body functioning because you get to support your hormones. You just get to support your overall body's health by eating this way, and this helps you achieve weight loss much easier. And then it's easy for someone to see her on this low GI diet and think that the reason that she's losing all that weight is because she's eating foods that are low on the GI diet. But is that true? Well, we'll get to that part. First, let's talk about the fear that comes with this GI index. We know that the GI measures how fast our blood sugar rises and spikes our insulin. And because insulin is linked to fat storage, high GI foods are seen as bad, while low GI foods are seen as the better options. And part of the reason that high GI foods are seen as bad is because they're mostly associated with foods that are very high in carbs. Think of potatoes, white bread, cookies, and even fruits like I talked about in my last video. Since people already fear these foods just because of their sugar or carb content, the minute that they see these foods on a high GI chart, this just adds fuel to the fire because they already have this natural or, like ingrained fear of these foods. And now you add the fact that they're high on the GI. That's enough to make people very afraid of eating these foods. And to make matters worse, we have seen the rise of low GI diets that promise to help people lose weight. And that just compounds the problem. It compounds this fear of these foods. But are low GI diets as good as they are purported to be? Let's see why this creator thinks that these diets are a scam.
This is why the low glycemic index diet is a scam. I'm going to prove to you why just because something is low in glycemic index does not mean it's healthy. Let's take a look at ice cream, for example. Even though ice cream is sweet, it actually is pretty low in glycemic index, but doesn't mean it's healthy. No, it has no fiber at all. It's pretty high in fat and it has processed sugar, yet it has a low glycemic index because of the amount of saturated fat is in there. It slows down blood sugar absorption. Now let's take a look at watermelon. Watermelon is so healthy, it's so high in fiber, has tons of electrolytes, vitamins, and minerals, but it has a high glycemic index of 72. The whole idea of glycemic index is to describe how fast the glucose goes from the food into your blood.
Yeah, you can see how misleading that will be, because you will be having these low GI foods. Technically, they are low GI, but they are unhealthy. But that's not the only thing that's misleading when it comes to the GI. Let's talk about the biggest flaw that it has. One of the biggest issues with the GI is that it is measured in isolation. Take the example of when scientists measure the GI of white bread. They will have people eat white bread on an empty stomach and just white bread with nothing else. And because of this type of measurement does not consider things such as portion sizes, food combinations, and nutrient density. For example, if you just eat plain white rice, your blood sugar response will be one thing. But if you were to eat the same plain white rice and combine it with chicken and vegetables, then your blood sugar response will be very different. But the GI index does not consider this. It says that if you're eating white rice, you can assume that your GI is this high, and then it will measure the chicken by itself and the vegetables by themselves. And because of this, people will look at the chart and they'll see how high the white rice is, and they'll assume that white rice is bad for them without taking into account the fact that the other foods have a lower index, and this will bring the average index down. In fact, research has shown that combining foods at different GI levels is a very effective way to promote our health as well as our weight loss journeys, because your body will look at the meal in terms of the overall balance and not just treating one food by itself, unless you have it plain. If you're having plain white rice, that's another discussion. How about glycemic index and glycemic load? Are they the same? The GI index tells you how fast your blood sugar rises, but it does not actually tell you how much sugar is in the food. When it comes to how much sugar is in a serving, that's called the glycemic load. Now let's use ice cream as our example. Like she said, if you look at the glycemic index, you will see that ice cream has a value of 37. But what about the glycemic load? We know it's high because ice cream, unless you're having sugarless ice cream is going to have a high glycemic load. But if you're just looking at foods in terms of their GI, you'll not care about the glycemic load, and you might actually end up eating foods that are unhealthy and which have very many added sugars and yet have a low GI. And that might actually also make you avoid eating foods that are good for you, like watermelon. If we were to take the watermelon as our example, we see yes, it has a high GI, but watermelon is full of fiber and it's full of water, and you'll have to eat so much watermelon for you to get a massive sugar hit, if we're being honest. But that's not all. Many high GI foods also tend to be very high in other nutrients. Think of potatoes and fruit, and some are even relatively low when it comes to calories, which allows you to enjoy more nutrients for fewer calories. So if you judge your food just by its GI, you will not be really getting the full story. But of course, we cannot talk about GI without talking about insulin and its relationship with fat storage. The math goes like this when it comes to the high GI. You're told a high GI food will cause a spike in your insulin, and that will cause your body to hold on to fat, which means no fat burning for you and no weight loss for you. But science comes in and says that as long as you're in a calorie deficit, you will lose weight regardless of whether you're eating high GI foods or low GI foods or foods that are in between. And that as long as you keep eating these foods and remaining at a calorie deficit, you will lose weight. And if you're at maintenance, you will maintain the same weight that you're at right now. But if you go above your maintenance calories, whether or not you're having high GI or low GI foods, you will gain weight because you will be in a calorie surplus. And that brings us to our conclusion. In my Better in 90 program, we like to get the full picture. We don't like looking at a food just in terms of where it is on the GI. And that's because avoiding GI foods, high GI foods, is not only unnecessary, but it is also very highly restrictive. And when it comes to losing weight and keeping it off in the long term, what you really want is something that is sustainable, and restriction is not sustainable. That means that if you like white rice, eat white rice. But you have to be smart about what you're having with your foods, because like we said, your body will look at foods in terms of the overall balance. So if you're having your white rice, what will you have with it to make sure that you're not getting those blood sugar spikes. Let's see how you can manage your total energy. First, we use the +1 rule as if we are going to an event. As much as you can, avoid eating high GI foods alone, like eating plain white rice or plain white bread. Instead, add a buffer. For example, if you're having toast, add an egg in there. If you're having potatoes, add some lean beef. These small additions will blunt that blood sugar response naturally while allowing you to have the high GI foods that you like, while still avoiding the blood sugar spikes that we know will spike your insulin. Secondly, we have to think about context. High GI foods are good. Yes, they'll give you energy. Yes, they taste good. But do you really need to be having as many of them as you are? I see many people who are sedentary who have so many carbs that they don't really need that much of. Because yes, most of us need carbs, but there's a limit as to how much you need. You need carbs in relation to how active you are. So save your higher GI foods for the periods when you're being active so that your body can actually use that quick energy to fuel your movement instead of storing it. But if you're generally sedentary, you can think about reducing how often you eat these high GI foods. Finally, you need to focus on preferences rather than perfection. If following a low GI diet is not for you, if it leaves you feeling restricted or miserable, that's not something that you want to follow in the long term or even in the short term. And that's because you will not only be having a hard time staying on that plan, but you'll also likely face cravings for high GI foods, and that will lead you to maybe have so many of those high GI foods that you actually ended up in a surplus. Because we have seen what happens when people restrict, they restrict, and then they binge, and then they restrict. It's not really a good pattern. So instead of doing that, eat the foods that you enjoy in moderate portions so that you're able to remain consistent on your journey, because at the end of the day, consistency will always beat perfection. The good news is that you don't need to carry a chart with you whenever you're going shopping or out to eat. High GI foods are not toxic or guaranteed to make you gain weight. They are just fast in how they deliver energy into your body. And as long as you eat within your calorie budget and incorporate a wide variety of nutritious foods, you can stop worrying about the numbers. You don't even actually have to do what the first creator was saying, where you're told to just look at the GI and make sure that you're eating under 25. You don't need to do that. And that's because your body is more than capable of handling GI foods at all levels, high and low. Ice cream and watermelon, your body can handle all of that. So what's one high GI food that you have been avoiding that you're really excited to bring back? Let me know in the comments, and give this video a thumbs up if you're ready to stop over calculating your meals, and subscribe so that you don't miss out on next week's meal. I'll see you in the next one.